Tamara, welcome to the Novel Idea Society.
Thank
It's so
you.
nice to have you. Before we get started, I am going to play the video from Nav. It's real short, so it won't take away from much. Just one second. Let me figure out how to do this. We're only like 4 years into using Zoom. I should have no problem doing this. This one. Share. Okay. I hope you guys can hear this.
This is Superfan Nav Batia. Hope you enjoy the book. Tamara did an amazing job in writing this book. This is a story about Superfan and the hope and the resiliency and the championship ring. You'll find everything in this book.
So, and everything is in the book. Um, oh, hang on. Now we're hearing. Whoop. Old YouTube videos playing in the background. So thank you for being here. I know that it's a little crazy because the book just came out at the end of February. There's a Raptors game tonight, which is why Nav isn't here. But tell me, what are you doing in Toronto? What's the promotion for this been like? Give us an idea of where you are right now, because you usually live and work in Vancouver.
That's right. I live in Vancouver and it's really, really nice to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Um, yeah, the it's been like an amazing experience. Ever since the book has come out, we just found out it's been like 3 weeks on top of the bestseller list. So that has been amazing, amazing news. Nav has been doing a lot of the publicity. Obviously, people are very interested in hearing from him, and I've been doing like a few little things for people who are really keen on writing, because that's sort of my space in the publicity of it. So this is one of the events that we were doing. Last night we had a public Q&A at the Toronto Public Library. It was great fun. It was just like a really nice way to celebrate the book coming out and being on the bestseller list.
So how did you, a Vancouver-based CBC journalist, end up writing with a Toronto-based Canadian immigrant who's obsessed with basketball?
That's a great question. Um, Let me preface this by saying that I don't know anything about basketball. I am not a basketball fan. I didn't really know anything about Nav before I started writing the book. Um, but I'll just sort of like backtrack a little bit. So in 2019, when the Raptors were playing in the championship, I mean, as a journalist, you're kind of aware that something big is happening. So like even if you're not interested in that sport, you're just kind of like marginally aware of it. So I knew that there was this big game happening, and I was like, well, like my husband's a huge basketball fan, so I said, I'll watch one game with him. That one game ended up being the buzzer beater game. So like the best game in NBA history, probably. And I thought to myself, wow, this is an incredible sport. Didn't watch any other games after that until for some reason I had no idea why I suddenly decided to watch the game that they won the NBA championship with at. And so I basically, when I met Na for the first time, I joked with him. I said, the Raptors' lucky mascot, that's me, because I watched those two random games and here they go, they win the championship. So, anyways, I didn't really know Nav as a basketball person, but I grew up in Toronto, and so I had seen his billboards because he would have these billboards advertising for his car dealerships all around the city. And so I was aware of this guy who was known as the superfan who ran car dealerships. And that was about it. And then sometime after 2019, I actually fell, like I was just like stumbling across on Instagram, I found the account of his daughter, Tia Batia. And that's when I learned that Nav had adopted his daughter, which is very unusual in an Indian context. Indian society and culture tends to prefer male children. So here I was like, this man could have done anything, and he chose to adopt a young girl, a beautiful baby girl, and that just made me go, that's a cool guy. I want to learn a little bit more about him. So that was sort of like how I really became aware of who the Superfan was. And then in 2022, I got a random email one day from somebody who was like, "Hey, I know that you work at the CBC. We're looking for somebody to work on a co-writing, ghostwriting project with a Toronto South Asian businessman." And in my head, I was like, there's only one probably Toronto South Asian businessman whose story is really worthwhile telling. Um, and I was like, I wonder if Nav has written a book. And so I had a conversation with that agent, and I was like, yep, this sounds great as a preliminary conversation. That sounds great. And in the meantime, I was like on my phone, quickly searching if Nav had published a book or anything like that. He hadn't. She didn't tell me the person's name during that entire conversation. A week later, she called me back and said, okay, so I can now tell you it's Nav Batia. And I was like, I kind of knew that. The conversation started from there. And later on, I learned that they had apparently tried a bunch of sports writers to try and work with him. And no, none of them were quite capturing his voice because they were approaching the book from a very basketball lens, which makes sense. And the vision that Nav and his team had for this book was that it was more going to be a story about what it's like to be an immigrant in this country and to understand what it's, the person he is beyond the superfan persona. And so they were really looking for somebody who could do that. And so they tried a different approach and tried to find South Asian writers or people who had come from, who had that understanding of what it's like to move to another country. And so they asked me to write. It was not just me. I think it was a bunch of other folks that they reached out to write sample chapters. So I wrote like some, I can't remember. It was like 1,000 or 4,000 words. I can't remember. I wrote something for them just based on the CBC documentary on the Superfan. And that was all the material that I had to work with. And so I did that. And then a couple of weeks later, they said, whoa, you understand him, you get his voice. And so from there we started negotiating, and then I joined him as the co-author on his project in August 2022. So it was like a couple of months where we were working out the details, but that's essentially how I got to be on this project.
Can you fill people in for people who don't know what you like? Obviously, I know what you do at CBC, but what you do at CBC very naturally dovetails into writing this book with him. Can you tell people what your job is?
Absolutely. So I love what I do at CBC. I'm the producer of CBC First Person. This is where we publish personal essays written by Canadians or residents of Canada, like permanent residents, undocumented, whatever, as long as you live in Canada. We publish personal essays written by these folks in their own words. And my job as the producer of this section is to help people, refine their pitches, commission those essays, decide what we need to reflect on our website, and help them edit it, fact check it, and make sure that it reaches our journalistic standards and practices. So it's a job that really requires me to, help people who know that they have a great story to tell, but they don't know necessarily how to tell them, to help them get to that point where we can publish it. And at CBC First Person specifically, we're trying to amplify voices of those people whose stories are not reflected in mainstream media. Sam, I mean, you and I both know like the CBC and every other media organization can go a long way in doing better to reflect the diversity that is in this country, whether you look at that racially, from a religious point of view, from ethnic, from socioeconomic diversity, political views. Like we need to do a better job of reflecting that range. And so CBC First Person is a real opportunity to do that. And I'm fairly certain that that's why they also found me, because, like my job, as you say, just naturally dovetails with what they were looking for in a co-author. What was different in this project is that normally I work with people who at least have like some kind of draft. So they,
Oh
I might
no, I
helping
feel
them.
like I know where this is going.
Yeah, this was, I mean, they were very upfront with it that Nav was not going to be writing it. I was the writer, I was in charge, but it's his story and it needs to be told in his voice. So it was an amazing challenge because oftentimes as a producer, I don't get to write, and I love writing. So this was an opportunity for me to exercise a different muscle. Like it's the same type of work, but like different coin, different side of it. So instead of writing it, I'm editing it at work, and I got to flip it and try it in a different way. And it was just sort of naturally the same kind of work. Like when I'm editing, I try and slip into that writer's voice. And here I got to immerse myself in Nav's voice for over the course of like almost 2 years now, and 70,000 words, which is very different from the 700-word essays we publish at CBC First Person. So very complimentary type of work.
So I know when I had this conversation with Haley Wickenheiser when she wrote her book about lessons on the ice, which was also like largely about becoming a doctor and in the pandemic. Because I said to her, I felt like I was listening to you talk, but with this one, it's like I can feel it's his story, but it doesn't feel like it's necessarily his turn of phrase. So how did you tell his story? Because in her case, she said that's because I literally recorded this book in voice notes and then they were just transcribed and fine-tuned, and it wasn't a case of they had to retell anything. It was literally just her talking, and that's how the book came out. But this isn't that. So I'm curious, how did you two work together to come up with something that made you both happy that also wasn't completely from scratch on your end?
Yeah, I mean, the writing was completely from scratch on my end. Um, but essentially, Nav and our first time we met, it was in person. So I don't think we were even recording anything. It was just like an opportunity for me to get to know him. I'd already signed the deal to be his writer at that point, but it was really just like, we need to get on the same page in terms of who we are and what we're trying to do with this project, and what it is that we want to try and accomplish. And so that was like a really nice conversation between the two of us, and his manager, Rinku, who is like with him every step of the way and is just like a wonderful partner to have throughout this process. Um, so yeah, so we met in person, and it was really funny because I remember the first time I met him, I had actually biked over. This is going to sound so Vancouver of me, but like I biked over to the meeting, and I got to we were meeting at the Fairmont where they were staying, and so like I walked in with like my bike pants and my pannier, and my laptop was in there, and he just like looked at me. He was like, "What is this bag? I'm so fascinated by my pannier." And I was like, this is a bike bag. Like this, it's like I biked over. And he just kind of like looked at me and he was like, you biked over? And his manager Rinku was like, Nav, she's from Vancouver. They bike and walk everywhere. So it was like this really funny moment that kind of broke the ice between us. Anyways, so we met
He
in
didn't try to
person.
give you a car?
He did not try and give me a car. He was like, are you sure you don't want me to drive you back to your office or your home? And I was like, no, I've got my bike here. Like, where would I even put my bike in your car? And I'm like, it's a beautiful sunny day. And he was just like so confused. He's like, why would you bike anywhere? Anyway, um, he does own car dealerships. So yeah, so then after that, because he's in Toronto and I'm in Vancouver, we had regular Zoom calls, so we would meet for 2-3 hours on a stretch, and we would chat. And Nav is very used to telling the basketball side of his story, and he is very well um, media trained, so he knows how to answer very quickly in like a minute or 2 minutes. Like he knows how to hit those broadcast interviews. Getting him to open up and write in, or like to think more like longer, deeper stories to try and like evoke memories from him was quite the challenge and exercise in gaining his trust, because he's actually a very private person. Despite the fact that he's such a public persona, he's a very private person. And so eventually I think we just realized that there's a lot of similarities between Nav and me, which I know will sound unusual because he's a 71-year-old Sikh man and I'm a 35-year-old woman who's not religious. So we come from different perspectives, but there's actually a lot of similarities between us. And I think that that's where the trust built. And so we would just talk at length, and I would record all the interviews, and then I started writing from that. And I had this idea for the book structure, which um, the Raptors came into Nav's life in 1995. He was like already in his 40s, and now, as I mentioned, he's like in his 70s. So I was like, if this book is his like memoir from like his childhood to now, we can't have a book that is nothing for basketball fans and then all basketball at the end. Like we have to find a way to like make the basketball integrated into the narrative throughout, very mindful of who the audience for this book is. And so I came up with this idea that we will just like weave back and forth between his personal life and his basketball life. And when I went back and looked at all the interview notes that I had, I realized that a lot of his personal life was being reflected in his basketball life. And so I suggested that we should, put chapters back and forth that kind of like, if the reader picks up on it, great, they'll see that they're parallel themes. If they don't, it's just great because it's peppered anyway between alternating between personal and basketball, but there is a theme there. And so the publisher and Nav's team really liked that idea. And so that's what we went with. And so in terms of writing, I would say that it is Nav's voice and perspective, but the way the themes have been tied together um, are almost like my understanding of Nav's life. And he was very open for it to be that collaborative thing. And when we started the project, he and his manager said, maybe we need to think about like how we write this book. Like, is it really a memoir or is it something else? Is it about how you are interpreting him? Like, what does he mean to young Canadians? And in the end, we still decided it was a memoir, but I would say it's a very collaborative process between the way he thinks and the way I sort of understand him. And so the book is sort of like an amalgamation of our thoughts.
Do you know if Penguin came to him and said, we want to do a book on you, or did Rinku pitch that to? I just feel like Rinku is like the businessman that gets Nav everywhere. So was it a case of they came to him and said, we want to do this, and then the ball was rolling that way? Or did they say, I think there needs to be a book about him, and approach publishers? Like, I'm just curious what kind of interest there was there.
From what I understand, and I wasn't privy to those conversations because when I came onto the project, the deal with Penguin was already in place. But from what I understand, there had been discussions between the two of them between Penguin and Nav and Rinku to work on some kind of project, and what that project was evolved over time. So
Oh,
I
okay.
think they had been in conversation for a very long time, and then they eventually landed on the idea of doing a memoir. But I don't know what that original project was that they had in mind. I vaguely want to say that it was some kind of coffee book for some Raptors, special occasion or something like that. I don't know because I like all I know is that when I got involved, it was a straight up memoir was what was on the table.
So when you put this together, was it, I write all the basketball things, I write all the personal things, and then pepper them together? Or did you write back and forth from start to finish?
I wrote, okay, so I know you've interviewed a lot of writers for this.
Everyone does it differently, and that's why I ask.
Yeah. So in terms of timeline, I'm not sure like what you've heard is like the average turnaround time for a book, but this book was a sprint, not a marathon. Um, and most books are marathons. So it's very, very fast from what my understanding of the book publishing world is to start writing a project or interviewing in August 2022 and to be in production by October 2023. Like that is a very fast turnaround. Most books take sometimes like a year or two to just write before they even get to the copy editing stage. We were done way faster than that. So I didn't have the luxury to finish interviewing and then write. I was writing as I was interviewing. So because Nav was more comfortable writing about his basketball life, I started writing the basketball content first. And then as he trusted me more and started revealing more of his personal life, I started working on the personal chapters. And then I went back, and once I realized what themes were being paralleled, then I went back and rewrote some of the introductions and some of the sections to sort of make them flow together. So that was sort of the process of how the book came together, like in terms of like the actual writing.
So how many drafts did you have before it was like, oh, we're done? Because this sounds very quick, like very, very quick to me.
I would say, how many drafts did we have? The first draft went in December 22. That was really fast. Like
Wow, that's
like
very
4 months.
fast.
Yeah, 4 months in was the first draft delivery. And I think I delivered the second draft in April 2023. And then it was being copy edited by July, August, I want to say. So it was really, really fast. So in between like the second and the copy edited version, then we were doing really fast turnarounds, like maybe 2 to 3 weeks to get through edits. But it was a really, really fast process. But as a journalist who's used to working on deadline, it at the same time for me it was like, okay, now I just need to sit down and write. So I just did.
Hmm.
Whereas I think I for this project I didn't get to feel like I've heard a lot of folks who are writers describe it as like art or passion, and for me it was like I felt like a journalist on deadline. It felt no
It's a
different than my
project.
daily job. Yeah, it's like something I need to do. It's a deadline I need to hit. We need to move on, quickly, quickly, quickly. And so it was very reminiscent of working in daily news. Like that's exactly the energy that I had or felt like I was working with while working on this project.
But you didn't do this while also working for CBC, my understanding, correct?
I did.
Did you not take a leave?
I only took 4 weeks off.
What?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I took 1 week off to come to Toronto and spend a week with Nav, going to basketball games, meeting his family. And then I took 3 weeks off to write the book, and that was it. And
If
then the
you
rest
could
I
do
just kind
that
of did it.
again, would you do that differently?
Would I do it differently? So there were personal circumstances at the time that didn't let me do it that way.
Okay.
Um, just like complicated, like just the way things were at work and professionally and what was going on in my personal life. I just couldn't take the time off at that point. I just needed to get it done. But I have said to myself that if like another opportunity to write a book comes along, I won't do that to myself. So
Okay. Okay.
yeah, like
I
not
was like, as
because
someone who takes mental health very seriously, I'm a little concerned about that workload.
oh, that was just scratching the surface of it, Sam. There was way more happening in terms of workload. I was doing this while teaching at UBC, and as an adjunct professor, and I just handed in my final assignment. I'm working on my Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Nonfiction, and I just handed in my last assignment on Monday. So I was in an MFA program, writing this book, working full time, and teaching part time at UBC. Like all these things were happening at the same time. So I would say it was a lot, but I, I I thrive on being busy. So I was not, um,
Unfortunately, you're speaking my language, so I understand.
yeah,
But I have to ask, are you still married?
oh yes, I am very happily still married. Um, No, so the hilarious thing in all of this is that my husband is a lawyer, and so he's used to working 70, 80-hour weeks. So, but as a unionized employee of CBC News, I don't usually work more than 40 hours a week, unless I'm being paid overtime. And so we just had very different experiences with work. And then he had a change of job that suddenly he was in a unionized environment working 35 hours a week, and the week he signed that job was the week that I signed all of this up, like to work on Nav's book and to start the MFA program. So I was like, what timing that we just like basically swapped working, him working like 40 hours a week and me working 70 hours a week. And it was great. I got it, like I have no regrets about how we did that. But now I'm very much looking forward to, I promised myself like for the next 6 months, I'm just going to do my job 9 to 5 at CBC, and that is going to feel like a relaxation vacation for me. That is
I
what
do
I need.
feel like you learn things about yourself in those kind of situations, though, that when pushed to that amount, that you're like, I didn't know I was capable of that.
Yeah, and it turns out like I was perfectly fine. Like I was still, I love swimming and biking. I was still going like swimming and biking 5 times a week. I was only like I was like still meeting all my friends and I was still managing all the work. The only thing that suffered for me in that period was I normally read something like 40 to 50 books a year. And that in that period, I think I read like 20 books, which for me is like, okay, this is where I cut out. And that makes me kind of sad because I now the size of the books that I have to read and catch up on is very, very large. Yeah.
So back to basketball, because
Yeah.
I have to ask, would you consider yourself a basketball fan now? Like, how did you go through writing about a sport that I mean, you're 2 games in, then writing a book about it. So how where do you stand on basketball now?
Um, well, I don't watch basketball games even now.
You're not even watching March Madness? Come on.
No, I mean, okay, I guess I had a friend tell me if the super fan couldn't make you a basketball fan, then
That is
probably,
fair.
it's not your thing. Um, I'm just relieved that my husband loves basketball so much because if this was a book about any other sport, I don't know how I would have written it. Like he was sort of like in my ear being like, you should ask Nav about this really cool moment. Or you should be like, you can't write that. Like, what is that? That doesn't mean anything. Like, you don't describe, I don't know, like dribbling the ball or a windmill 360. I was like, I don't know what these things are. So he was like the little basketball whisperer in my head. But where I am with basketball now is when my husband Jacob is watching a game and I will see the game. Like I'm probably just like sitting right next to him reading a book and then he's watching the game. Suddenly if I look up on TV, I'll have a random anecdote to share that is somehow not related to the person on the screen. And that is it. That is my contribution to basketball. I'll be like, here's a random fact. And he'd be like, that's so cool. And what do you know about that thing? And I'm like, I have no clue. That's not a Nav story. I
That's
don't know
where it
what to say.
ends.
Yeah,
I
that's
will
where it
give you my
starts.
nugget of wisdom, and I'm going back to my book now.
Exactly. Yeah.
I want to talk about Nov's family,
Mhm.
um, because that part of the story I actually enjoyed the most. I grew up playing basketball, but the story about his daughter and the fact that they chose to adopt a little girl, and not just a little girl, but a little girl who had very serious health problems. What was it like getting him to open up about her? Because that felt like there's a lot of very personal details, both about Tia and his wife.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, there was a lot of reluctance on his part to talk about those things. And it wasn't easy by any means. But I think what helped him sort of open up to me was that I actually told him a little bit about my sort of like upbringing as a person of Indian descent and, how I was treated as a girl growing up and the experiences that I had and why I am such, like a proud feminist today. And it was moments like that where he realized that I was able to understand some of the issues that he was talking about in a way that like was perhaps more nuanced than some of the other questions that he's had. I've seen previous interviews which have been done about arranged marriages, for example. And there is a certain way that I've seen other people approach them where it's almost like, oh, it's like you're being sold off or something. It's like,
How could
there's
you do
not like
that?
this, how could
Yeah.
you do that? Yeah, like it's not like this understanding that there is like this cultural practice and it can be beautiful. It can certainly be problematic, but it can be a beautiful experience. And so I think when he realized that I understood some of those cultural nuances, he started opening up. And what I got from Nav in those moments was his emotional reaction, but not the factual details.
Oh,
So those factual details to piece those things together actually came from interviews that I did with Arvinder, his wife, and Tia, his daughter. And so they were able, like I interviewed them to layer in those facts. So I would take those facts and try and write them in Nav's voice from his point of view. And so, as much as I say the book is a collaboration between me and Nav and a lot of like Rinku sort of in the background as well, the book is also a collaboration of Arvinder and Tia because they filled in a lot of gaps, like where Nav knows how he's emotionally reacting it, but he does not remember the who, what, when, where. details, and so a lot of that came from them. And it was wonderful talking with both those women. I really enjoyed my time with them. Arvinder is probably my favorite person of Nav's family. She is so sassy. She knows exactly how to put Nav in his place. And so I loved her. Like we connected so much. And almost the entire interviews with with Arvinder were done in Hindi. She's way more comfortable speaking in Hindi than she is in English. So when I realized that she will open up more if I switch to Hindi, we just did everything in Hindi after that. And Tia was just so welcoming, and um, she has a very good memory, and so she was like able to provide little details. She's like Nav will say, I just love the dress that she was wearing, and I was like, what was she wearing? It's like, I don't know. I just remember it was a very cute dress, and I would like ask Arvinder or Tia, so what were you wearing on the? And they would pull up photo albums and be like, here's the photo the dress that she was wearing. So a lot of those details came from them actually.
So when it comes to proofreading and copy editing, is who in that conglomerate, we will call them, was who was approving and fact checking and doing all those things for you? Like, I'm assuming it wasn't Nav. So was it Rinku? Was it the ladies? Like, how did you, through the copy editing process, who was reading those drafts on top of the publisher?
So I was getting feedback directly from Rinku, and Rinku was handling the family.
So you
So
didn't have
I
to have like multiple conversations with each.
Exactly, yeah. And so he sort of was the in between, because one of the things that, Nav and Rinku both said to me, I think at some point Nav forgot that he was working on a book that was going to be published. Um, he sort of just approached it as like, I'm now having my weekly conversation with Tamara, and we are just chit-chatting about everything. And I think we built such a trust and rapport that he
He's
told me
just
a
here to
lot
see
of
his
things.
friend.
Yeah, like he told me a lot of things that I was like, oh, this is fantastic. This is such great detail. And I would put it into the manuscript, and then they were like, oh no, like we didn't mean for that to be published. Um, so I think, they did the, like not Rinku did the sort of sensitivity edit with the family and figured out, okay, what are the pieces that we actually want to put out there in the world? And what are the pieces of our lives that we actually still want to keep private? Because at the end of the day, they're still a very private family. And I think it's important, as subjects who are writing memoirs, to not put everything out there, to keep a little bit just for yourself. And
Mhm.
so that was what I think. Most of their edits were more along those lines than they were about the fact checking. I'm a journalist. I get my stuff right.
What's the difference between you being a co-author and a ghostwriter? Like, did you automatically agree to that in the beginning? Because not every ghostwriter or co-writer gets the title. They get a with or a, co-written by, or how did you decide with the publisher on what your credit was going to be for this book?
So initially, when I signed the contract with them, it was very vague language. And that was, I think, almost deliberate on both our parts because I hadn't, like really had the chance to talk to Nav before working on the project. So I didn't know if I wanted my name on the project. Um, and I think from their end, I mean, I was sort of an unknown quantity to them too. So I think from both of ends, we just kind of left it as like, we'll figure out how we want to deal with credits at a later stage, but it was sort of leaning more towards ghostwritten work, which I was fine with. And then when I handed in the first draft, I was really like I felt like I had done something that I wanted to put my name to.
Hmm.
And the feedback that we got from the publisher was just like, this is great stuff. They were like, we
Right.
love what you have done here. And so at that point, it was somewhere between the first and the second draft that we negotiated. We went back and we renegotiated the agreement, and it was decided that I would get front cover credit as the co-author with Nav.
And what was that like for you?
I never had this dream that I mean, I knew from like high school, maybe early university, that I wanted to be a journalist. I love writing. Um, but I never thought that I wanted to be a published writer. In fact, one of my best friend's moms, she said to me very early on in university, she's like, someday you're going to be a published author. And I was like, I don't know if I have anything to say. I don't even know what I'd want to write about. Like, I just, like it's not something I thought for myself. But she had this sort of like, no, you're going to get there one day. Um, so today, to be a published author, uh, to be a best-selling published author, it feels like living a dream that I didn't even know I had. So it's wonderful. I'm really glad to have had this experience, and I feel very lucky that my first project was working on something that has the capacity to um, share a person's story who is so much more than just the one thing that most people know him for. And it was really lovely to work with them.
Do you have another like book in mind or a person in mind that you're considering even pitching to the publisher now that you have this relationship?
Yeah, I'm actually working on another book proposal with somebody else who also is looking for, like, wants to write a co-authored book. I can't say too much about it right now because we're in the process of trying to acquire the right fit for it. But it's something that, again, I think it's very similar to Nav's story in that I think people know this person for one reason,
Hmm.
and their story is so much more complicated and nuanced and layered. And I think that publishing that person's story will make so many other people feel seen and validated. So I hope that that project finds a publisher someday. Um, as for myself, I've been thinking about what, there's co-authored work is one thing, or ghostwritten work is one thing. But I've been thinking about what would I write about if it was just my book.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I'm sort of slowly developing as an idea, sort of like in the very early writing stages of it, I've written maybe about, oh, I don't know, like 20,000 words or so of it, is what it's like to be a third culture individual. So if that term is not familiar to a lot of folks, it's the simple way of, I guess, explaining it would be the children of expats. So,
Hmm.
but the third culture term comes in from like you're not a person, like you were born, your parents are of a certain culture, you grew up in a different country than they did, and now you're citizens of yet another country. So that third culture, the in-between place that you're not a citizen of, and that's not your parent, like it's not your heritage, but you grew up in that place that formed a strong part of your identity. That's what I want to write out because I mean, my parents were expats living in the Middle East, so I have a lot of love for the Middle East, but I'm not Middle Eastern, and I'm a Canadian citizen, and I'm of Indian descent. So like it's like another layer of identity
Where in the Middle
that
East did you grow up?
I grew up in this country called Oman.
And where is
It's
that?
Oman is about it's like a short flight away from UAE. I think
Okay.
it's like, yeah. So it's right across the Arabian Sea from India.
Oh, and how did you end up there?
My parents were expats, so they had like Oman was had a petroleum oil discovery, and they were looking for people to help them grow the economy. My parents were like amongst lots of other expats from all over the world who ended up in Oman, and it was a very different experience. Like I know a lot of expat kids who grew up in countries like Saudi Arabia, and their experiences are very different from mine because Oman is nothing like Saudi. I mean, it's not uncommon to see women wearing bikinis in Oman. So I think it like has very interesting, um, like, it subverts at least what I realized in post 9/11, moving to Canada, is that growing up in Oman, I had the opportunity to help subvert a lot of assumptions and stereotypes that people had about what the Middle East is like. So I'm very proud of the time and very fond of the time that I spent in Oman, and I have a lot of lovely memories of it, and it forms an interesting part of my identity, but I can't actually claim any part of being Omani.
Hmm.
So yeah.
So what brought you to Canada then? I'm sorry, now we're deep diving.
That's okay. I love talking about this stuff. I think identity, like politics and just like not politics, I just like identity is just like such an interesting thing to explore.
Mhm.
Um, my parents, I mean, living in Oman as an expat was not a long-term solution. It was just something that everyone who came there as an expat knew that you had a fixed period of time that you were there for.
Mhm.
Um, and then it was time to move on. And my parents could have chosen to go back to India, or they could have chosen to go elsewhere. And I think after so many years living outside of India, they just felt like it might be easier for me and my brother to live elsewhere. Um, and so they applied to a bunch of different countries, and Canada was just the first one that said yes. So we ended up here in 2000.
Gotta love that expediency.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that's interesting. I think that a lot of people would read that. And I think that people would also be interested to learn more about that country because there is just such an interesting culture around oil. And not, and I say that as in Saskatchewan where oil is a big deal, but more in rural areas than the major cities, but also in Alberta where oil is king. So when you think of oil on a world stage, I think that's not even a country I'd heard of prior to you saying that. And I'm not ashamed to say that. I'm not going to pretend I know a country exists that I didn't. But the UAE is so well known for oil as well. So it's just interesting the culture around like the transients that come in with moving in for a short period of time, making some money, doing the thing, and then moving on with life. But the culture that goes with that is so interesting. So maybe there's a book in there for you on that too.
Maybe, hopefully. I mean, let's positively visualize it one day.
I'll just give you a list of book ideas and you can, I've always said, maybe one day I'll write a book, but I haven't even written an opening line. So that's not anytime soon. So what's
On the
next for
topic,
you?
sorry, can I just interrupt? On the topic of moving, I just wanted to say like one thing that I think maybe people will find like an interesting coincidence. I think it's a reason why Nav and I work so well together. So in a couple, like his family comes from this like part of what is now Pakistan called Sialkot, and
Mhm.
that's where my family came from. Then
Oh,
his family moved to Delhi, and my family moved to Delhi as well from after partition. And where his family lives in Delhi, like my family lives like maybe 10 minutes away from that. And then even though he moved to Mississauga in 1984 and my family came in 2000, we live like 20 minutes apart in Mississauga. So in like a strange way, these are just like some of the like random coincidences like between Nav and me where I'm like, oh, like I get him. Like even in terms of moving, we've done similar things. And he went to California and my dad went to Florida. So it's like, they're like very strange parallels. Like they were almost in both him and my dad were in the United States at around the same time. So it was like to just like I get him in a way because like he's very close to what my family has done as well. Not
does he,
car salesman, not super fans of basketball, but in other ways, like in cultural ways, I really get him.
but does he remind you of your dad in that way? Because like I was shocked to hear he was in his 70s. Like full on like did the math more than once because this man does not look like he's in his 70s. So, does he remind you of like a father figure in that way or was he more just almost like a colleague that seems younger than he is? Because he to me seems much younger than he actually is.
Oh, his energy levels are just something else. Like, you know how when I say I can handle like 70-hour weeks and that's fine? He's handling probably 100, 120-hour weeks and he is just fine. Um, he's operating on a different level altogether. But I would say like Nav felt to me somewhere in between like favorite uncle and grandfather. Like that was sort of like our relationship. Like there were moments when I would look at him and go, Nav, really? Like really? Like in a way that I would only talk to a family member. So
Mhm.
I think it's a testament to how wonderfully welcoming he is that he could make me feel that way because I can be very guarded as a journalist, like very like I keep my distance from you and I think we both help to break down each other's walls.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay. I should ask because we're coming up on an hour here and also it's quarter after 10 where you are. Does anyone in the room have a question? I don't know why I gave myself a British accent for that. Oh,
Are you involved in the movie at all? Right.
are you involved in the movie at all? Is the question from the room.
I am not involved in the movie at all. There has been some discussion of writing, a chapter in maybe a paperback version of the book that, that might come out after the movie is released to sort of update the story that we have. But I am not involved in the scripting or filming or anything like that. I'm a
Is
writer.
there a date for this movie?
Nav said yesterday 2025, and I'm like, whoa, I don't even know if they're in production, but they move lightning fast. This book happened way faster than I think anyone expected, so they might just be able to turn around a movie faster than anyone expects.
All right. And is his daughter going to be part of it?
I don't know how the casting is going to work. The only person I know for sure who is playing Nav is Kalpen.
Right.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Questions on the interwebs? Sorry not to make you stand out, Nancy, but your camera's on. So I'm like, any questions? Is there anything you want to talk about, Tamara, that I didn't touch on that you really wanted to get through in this book that maybe, or feedback you've heard from anyone? Has the family read the book and told you what they thought of it, or what's happening? How does that go?
So Tia has mentioned of in a couple of places where there were like chapters about her like really made her cry.
Aw.
Nav has told me in a few moments that when he was recording the audiobook version that he teared up, like he almost forgot that, like it was like he sort of said it was like this moment where it was like I didn't, even though it was like my story, I kind of forgot about it because of the way that you had shared it. It was like just like so beautiful. So um, it's really lovely to hear moments like that. And I've had a lot of folks come up to me and say everything from the range of, I can hear you like me because they know me so well. They're like, I can hear your voice in the writing, to other people coming up to me and saying, if you hadn't told me that you had co-written it, I would have never known that this wasn't Nav talking.
Oh,
So I've heard the range, and I think it's just like it's what I haven't heard is anyone say, thankfully, that this doesn't sound like Nav. Like I've heard like people say this sounds like him, even if it's not how he speaks, but this feels like it has his voice and his personality. So that has been really affirming to read or to hear.
have you met any of these crazy basketball players that he references? Are you and Vince Carter BFFs yet?
No, I am not BFFs with Vince Carter. But his mom, Michelle Carter, who is like an absolute force of nature, she oh gosh, she was so generous with her time and gave me a lot of great anecdotes and um, again, like you had asked about fact checking. I think in many ways because Nav's memory is not spot on in terms of the factual accuracy. Talking to other people in his life, and Michelle Carter was a huge part of that, sort of helped me fill in like those details that it's like, okay, like Nav says this, you say this, found a newspaper clipping. Okay, we're gonna, like this is how we're gonna deal with that part of it. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I don't have any more questions for you. This has been so lovely to get to chat with you in person and not just through our inter chat thing at work. Um, but I so appreciate your time and your willingness to talk about your book and how you put this together. And I hope you'll send me a note and let me know who that person is at some point, because I'm nosy and I'm like that. But I really would love for you to get some rest too, because I know you've had a long couple of days. So thank you so much for being here. And I hope you'll come back and join other book club meetings if there's books that interest you.
I would love to do that. Thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful opportunity to actually to talk about the actual book. Because a lot of, it's been very obviously like a Nav celebration, and I love that. I'm so happy that people are reading the book, but this is like the first conversation that I've had where we've actually talked about the writing, as opposed to just like promoting the book. So this has been
Yeah.
just such a wonderful experience for me. And so I thank you for inviting me. I've had a great time, and I would love to join future sessions of your book club.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Have a lovely evening.